Good evening. Good evening. I hope you enjoyed your break. We're ready to get started with our second presentation of the evening. We've gone through an introduction of Evelina Maho, our presenter for this session on the Board of Directors' roles and responsibilities. Without further ado, I'm going to hand the baton off to Evelina. Thank you.
We first want to talk a little bit about our mission. I'm starting off the talk on our roles and responsibilities as board members. It's really important that our mission and our vision should be a part of our board orientation and onboarding process. For those of you that are seasoned board members, this might be a few reminders. For those of you that are new and coming on board, this is a great time to attend our session. Our mission and vision, it should be included in new employee orientation packets as well. Orientation is critical and a key to a successful organization. So in a perfect world, the mission and the vision should guide the oversight process, like the metrics. Does our data that we get, your board reviews, seem to be aligned with our mission statement? Are you looking at the right things? So for an example, if you want to expand services, you look at the services you provide and how many or how much you provide over that time. There is also science of data, which we'll touch a little bit on as we talk a little bit about quality, as well as there's also another entire discipline on how to improve and change things or enhance the way we operate as a healthcare system. How do you feel about your board meetings and training and onboarding? So we want to make sure that we begin to kind of ask some of these questions as we're going through some of our talk. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about formulating and approving policies, there's certain aspects of it. So when we're approving policies, knowing and managing all policies is a hard challenge, and sometimes it's unrealistic, especially if you have a large healthcare system. There are many management policies you will delegate and leave to facility management. However, there are policies, more plans and bodies of work that you want to have your fingerprints on, or at minimum have read and have acknowledged it and approved it. What do you think of some of these? Some of the things I think about when we're talking about formulating and approving policies are maybe around emergency response plans, a communication plan, quality and performance improvement plans with certain priorities outlined, a risk management plan, a grievance plan, possibly even an audit plan. Also the licensing of staff and credentialing and privileging process as well. So there are many examples we can provide. Next slide, please. As board of directors, we also should keep in mind how we plan for the future. It's essential that usually most organizations, they might have a 3-year strategic plan. So how does your board of director plan? Do you have facility planning retreats? In today's age and with the pandemic happening, it may be virtual meetings that we're congregating at and beginning to kind of talk and formulate our plans of action. It's really important to make sure that the board directs and participates in the planning for short and long term. We also want to make sure that when we're doing the short-term planning, is it annual? Is it consistently at the same time, season of the year? And a lot of that is based on, regulatory agencies or reporting, time frames or funding sources. So there's a lot of logistics that go into that. And the last part of that is the evaluation of the plan. We want to make sure that we have adequate and appropriate measures and metrics and reporting mechanisms. Do we develop a subcommittee to kind of begin to talk into those different areas as well? and focus. Next slide, please. One of the things that we are charged with as a board of directors is the selection, the evaluation, and the support of this chief executive officer. In addition to that, an oversight, monitoring, the evaluation of the healthcare center and its operations on a much higher level. Okay, and then the last piece of this is monitoring and evaluation of the board. What does that look like as well? Does the CEO, has an input into that aspect of the work as well? Next slide. Okay. So one of the things, again, we are charged with as board of directors is to select and evaluate. It's important that there's final action from the part of the entire board, that they have input into the selection of a chief executive officer. As a reminder, a CEO, the chief executive officer, is the only employee of the board, okay, typically. And the CEO does the day-to-day authority to manage and lead. It's usually customary and good practice to make sure that an evaluation is conducted on that CEO. The CEO is evaluated consistently with descriptions and goals in a contract, okay? And the other important part of and roles, responsibilities of our board of directors is to support the chief executive officer. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I wanted to touch on is the importance of monitoring and evaluating the board. How do we evaluate ourselves as board of directors? Okay, so one of the things is we want to make sure that the mission and the vision are achieved by evidence, by healthcare standards, performance standards. What are they, and what does the board use? Okay. Typically, it may also include the budget, the financial aspects, the reports of it, the business plan measures, clinical measures, the strategic plan measures. And I'm going to reserve some time at the end of our talk to kind of discuss a little bit of some examples of this. But making sure that the governing board or the board of directors also has a clear, actionable framework for oversight of all the dimensions of quality is also a good recommendation. I'm going to have Zep drop in your chat box a white paper through IHI that talks on the framework for governance of health system quality. And it's a good resource for you all to take, and I recommend everyone to take a look at that. So the tool for trustees and healthcare system leaders to evaluate and score current quality oversight is also an important process and something to keep in mind as you're thinking about how we evaluate ourselves. It's a good document as a guiding document to utilize as well. I'm going to go ahead and have you all move to the next slide. Thank you. We want to make sure that we're also monitoring and evaluating the board, okay? One of the recommendations is to conduct a self-assessment annually, revisit and making sure that our defined bylaws are current and up to date. We also want to talk as a team, as board of directors, as a group, to talk a little bit about what our goals are, if there are any. I want to pause here and just remind our board of directors that when you come into a group, you are a representative of maybe a certain target population that healthcare system might be providing services to. So it's really critical to do your homework, however that might be. It may be occasional conversations at a local community gathering. It might be looking at some of the recent public health reports around that particular community or, region, and how that might affect our health as a population, and bringing kind of that knowledge to the table. So it's not necessarily what you as an individual board of director would contribute as your goal, but what you bring to the table is a representative of those who cannot speak at that table. So you represent that broader population. So I wanted to make sure that we talk a little bit about that aspect of our roles and responsibility as it relates to how we monitor ourselves and how we evaluate that board as a team. Okay. So there's another important aspect. We are charged with the next slide, please. We are charged to have some oversight over the financial aspect of the healthcare system. We should look at how to look at formulating and the formulation of budgets, the financial health of that healthcare organization, and also being able to review it, understand it, the current state or even the projections, and the language behind that before we actually approve financial policies or procedures. Okay, so it's really important to have that. That is an important role. We also are charged with safeguarding the assets. Okay, we also, again, review and approve the healthcare center budget. It's important to I'm sure that some of our board of directors that are in attendance today have had experience in the development of a budget. And when we're talking about healthcare systems, our budget are going to be comprised of many different revenue streams. There could be made up of grants and other opportunities from private, sector that might contribute to some of the work that you all do. So understanding what programs exist, how they are funded, some of the rules and regulations around the dollars is really important part of the financial aspect and our obligation as board of directors to that. Okay, next slide. The clinical piece is also just as important as the finance. We want to make sure that we're approving credentials, privileges of medical staff, okay? And we want to act on healthcare center recommendations and that there's a consensus and a warm body, okay? We want to make sure that we understand our clinics, our healthcare centers' current needs are, what direction we are headed as far as the types of services, the array of services, the quality of the services, the amount of the services, the timing and how we mirror possibly even the needs of the population. We as board of directors should be able to understand, so to speak, what that lay of the land looks like in our urban Indian population. And from there, speak to some of these needs and being able to proactively take part in approving, credentialing, and privileging our medical staff and clinical staff members. A big part of your role is also approving the credentialing aspect of it, that policy work. Review and approve the QI plans. That is critical also. And it may be done annually or every 2 years. It really depends also on your accrediting body or in regulatory agencies that you all work with in your respective states and agencies. That you also receive the QI reports on a quarterly basis, because majority of the time, we talked a little bit about this, and that is the science behind that data, okay? Data is so critical that it helps drive change. And this is when we talk about data, we move into something called the improvement science. That data drives change, that we're talking about healthcare systems change work. It might be through the lens and the eyes of quality. It may be through the eyes and lens of revenue generation. It may be through the eyes of broad public health. Whatever it is and whatever services you all provide in your respective healthcare system, that's going to vary. The type of data that is gathered and how we improve that work is going to be based on what kind of data we provide, we give, and we collect at the healthcare center. It comes up to you through this report format. And by the time it gets to you as a board of director, we're able to comprehend that data, where it's coming from. Why is the staff, the healthcare system doing this particular PDSA? And how does that affect the quality, the safety, the access of healthcare to our the population we serve? So there's a lot of good work behind that, and we can't emphasize enough. And I think I'm also biased in that I've done some work in quality, and it's a really a big component in how we drive healthcare change and improving healthcare systems. Next slide. So we're going to dive a little bit into our duties. We're going to talk about duty of care, a little bit about duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, and we'll carve out some time also for questions and discussions on some of these different areas. Okay, next slide. When we're talking about duty of care, it's really important that we are fully aware that we have to make these careful decisions, because what decisions we make impacts the healthcare system, our staff, you know, and the services, and the outcome. How is this going to affect the population we are serving? So we have to make sure that we have the necessary information before making a decision. Making sure that we know what it means on our part and our CEO in that healthcare organization, what we call reasonable inquiry, okay? So both are necessary in care and oversight. So is the care you provide quality care and safe care? Okay, next slide. When we're talking about duty of care and reasonable inquiry, one of the things we strongly remind board of directors or any leader is not to be reactive. Also not to be proactive to the extreme level. And we'll talk a little bit about this also towards the end of our talk, but responding to facts and circumstances is a good way to make sure that we are within our I guess, scope, within our region, within our boundaries, okay? And we also want to make sure that when we are doing a reasonable inquiry, that our senior leadership are performing well when we do inquire about a specific incident, a specific policy or procedure, and how that might affect or impact our healthcare system and the way we operate. So making sure that we are able to, and we establish that through setting boundaries, and those boundaries are really based on how we develop our bylaws and how we operate and how we communicate with the CEO and the healthcare system itself. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're understanding what those boundaries might look like. The other important thing, next slide, please, is the duty of care as evidenced by, you know, our oversight of compliance systems, okay? Would I find it in your board minutes or board reports? So make sure that we're reading these things critically, and if we're able to look through some of these reports, we're able to comprehend what measures are, what are the current reports, and why are these reports coming to us for us to review as board of directors, and how will that, you know, allow me to understand it and then be, you know, engage in a meaningful discussion on how to provide maybe recommendations on different aspects of the healthcare system and how it will operate grants management. Another component could be also the coding and billing audits. These are important areas. We also want to make sure that we get or insist on the data you need for the decision. Again, the data, this is a big discussion all across and in all healthcare system, whether it's tribal, whether it's IHS, in urban Indian health organizations, even in the private sector. The quality of the data is so important, making sure that the data that we collect will be utilized for meaningful and impactful purposes. So making sure that once that report comes to us and we're reviewing the data, it's really for that purpose of making those decisions. Compliance, policy, and plan owned by the board, okay? So we operate and our duty of care is evidenced by this as well. Okay. Next slide. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of technical issue here. So continuing on duty of care, the oversight of compliance system, again, we can't emphasize that enough, that there must be a guiding document that allows the board of directors to make sure that we act and are complying within that, that system. We also are acting in good faith. No improper financial benefits or hiring. That is not in our scope of work of as board of directors, or establishing contracts. Okay, prudent person is standard, and as a board member practice due diligence. So reading materials, mastering the materials, being that smartest person in the room or the second smartest. Okay. But being able to understand, again, that material and how that material affects, again, the organization, how it may drive change, or maybe looking at the materials and seeing it as data that relates to public health or population health. Are we able to understand it? And are we practicing due diligence as a board member? So keeping those things in mind is really important. Always act in the interest of the corporation versus yourself, okay? So it's really important, and a gentle reminder for all board of directors and members of the board to make sure we do a self-check. You know, when I speak and I bring up a point, is it in the best interest of the organization, the UIO, or that particular health center that I'm a representative of? Am I speaking for the best interest of those we serve, for those who cannot speak and be able to do that? Next slide. The duty of loyalty, it's allegiance to the organization, basically. Are we committed to the goals, the expectations of the healthcare center? Am I, as a board of directors, something to ask yourselves, am I aligned with the core and fundamental mission, vision statements? Do I agree and support the goals and objectives at that healthcare center? Okay. Am I attending meetings regularly? And you all who are seasoned as board of directors, we all know that there are certain meetings that we have to have a quorum. We have to have an agreement on maybe accreditation bodies are going to be visiting, and we're preparing. And there are our C-suite leadership who are developing policies and procedures and protocols, and they have to be approved, and they need to be approved by a certain time and date. So there's always this ongoing process that's happening. And sometimes I'm going to say they're not regular. They, I think more than ever, our healthcare systems, especially during the pandemic, our healthcare systems have had to dramatically respond quickly and act on the pandemic, COVID-19, and how we have to realign some of our policies, procedures, and protocols to make sure that we meet the needs. To make sure that our staff is protected, to make sure that they're able to do the work. and then ultimately being able to align those recommendations to CDC, accrediting bodies, and other regulatory agencies. So it's really important to keep in mind and keep the back of the mind, your mind as a board of director. This might not be happening on a regular basis. You might be having an 8 o'clock meeting to talk about a policy or a procedure, okay? Also, conflict of interest, being aware of that, and a sole responsibility as a board of director, what that might be. And typically those are outlined in some of the bylaws. And evidence, okay? For example, attestation of conflict of interest, bylaws, the attendance, you know, all of those. Those are things that are looked at and are asked upon. So our board members not performing well, what do we do? What to do next? Okay, how do we address these things? Okay, next slide. The duty of obedience. As a board member, our behavior and conduct aligns with the bylaws and policies, and also includes fiduciary and financial role. Okay, you know, I've done talks about this particular topic before, and sometimes in Indian country, whether we're in urban Indian, tribal communities, tribal lands, you know, business is business. We have to engage on the best interest of our organizations and who we represent to conduct ourselves in accordance to those bylaws and policies. It's really easy for me to say, I'm the niece, or I'm the, you know, so-and-so is my cousin, so let's bend the rule here, or whatever. So, you know, we have to be very mindful and cognizant of making sure that we are performing, we are representing, we are speaking on the best interest, again, for the healthcare center and who it serves, the population you serve, with the highest level of integrity, honesty, and you know, coming into the work that you do with a kind spirit at the same time, okay, and being able to think about the current, maybe some historical aspects, the current way in which the healthcare system is operating, and what you all envision as a board of director. Okay, so there's a huge responsibility on that. Next slide. So when we're talking about fiduciary obligations, there might be some outside audits, internal audits that might occur, and that's something that's pretty typical and important to keep in mind, and a part of your operations as board of directors. External evaluations, possibly that's an avenue that a board of director and an organization might take to make sure that you know, that everything that we do and how we operate is not viewed or reviewed by internal stakeholders or ourselves. Okay, you might start there and then move into an external party evaluation. The data, the reports. What are some examples of some of these? Okay, so we need to look at some of those different types of reports that would make sure that it justifies our actions. It justifies, and there's that backup to say, yes, X% of dollars are utilized for, you know, telehealth or other types of opportunities that might come up for your healthcare center. Being able to look at these finance reports is really, really important. And then decisions in good faith. And part of that, again, I want to emphasize that it's really based on the facts, the information, the data that's given to you and for your review. Next slide. The corporate compliance for boards, you know, there's different components of it, okay? The corporate information, the reporting exists. We also make sure that not only are we able to create these reports, but that a mechanism is developed directly to the board or a subcommittee. And if that doesn't currently exist, that's something that should already be in your bylaws or established in your bylaws as a way to operate and communicate between a healthcare system and maybe the I don't know, nursing department, and coming up to the chief nursing executive as a C-suite leader, reporting that to the CEO, and a cumulative report along with other divisions coming up to the board of directors for review. Also, it's other components of it includes independent of the CEO, the data and reports assures the board there is a compliance with laws. It's timely and it's regular. Okay, so making sure that we understand who the regulatory agencies are, who do we need to answer to at all the different levels. Dr. Fowler talked a little bit about the funding sources, for example, for our UIOs and where the revenue funds and streams are coming from. We want to make sure that we understand that there's a reporting mechanism and there's an obligation for us to make sure that we gather and congregate and make sure that these things are all aligned and on time. Okay, next slide. So what happens with non-compliance? So state and federal recoup improper payments. There might be some penalties involved with this. Providers or healthcare centers are liable for submitting false or poor claims. You know, the state could also get involved. Inclusions from these are extreme cases. Exclusions in Medicare and Medicaid problems also might arise. Also, loss of grant monies. It's really important to make sure that when we are operating healthcare systems, all of our reporting mechanisms are in place, and that what we report out and what we review as board of directors, we understand that when we review the materials, the report, the data, that they're accurate and that they reflect truly the way the healthcare system operates, and it being able to be supportive to the programs itself is really important. But when we are not in compliance, these are some of the consequences of making, you know, that could happen. So I've seen some tribal organizations, for example, not submitting proper IDC rates, for example, where the federal government grant programs may not be able to fund because they're not up to date with their auditing. It affected their way in which and how and when they negotiate their IDC levels, and that really ultimately affected the way and how they were unable to then apply or compete for any grant dollars. So it's really important to make sure all of those different aspects of the healthcare system is in place. Next slide. We're going to move a little bit into board challenges. So healthcare is highly regulated industry, especially in Indian Health Services, in 638 facilities, IHS facilities, and our urban Indian health organizations. We're very highly regulated. And so we want to make sure that we understand some of the risks in patient care. Care is not automated, and communication can be a challenge for board members. The, understanding care coordination, sometimes also fragmented healthcare systems. So these are under risks in patient care. These are kind of some things that might come up. When we're talking about risk and reimbursement, government versus private, grant funding, Medicare, Medicaid problems. So even unintentional events could occur where our healthcare system might be challenged. So as a board of director, we want to make sure that we're understanding all the different, again, the type of healthcare that we're delivering, the services that we're providing, understanding our scope of work. We also want to talk a little bit about understanding what our state and federal requirements are for health centers, our type of urban Indian health organization we run and operate. We also must understand coding and billing as it relates to Medicaid, Medicare. We also want to make sure that we have a corporate compliance program. And so sometimes these are just a quick reminder, these are some challenges a board member might have if we don't understand some of these components. And the corporate compliance program is one of them. We want to know what mitigates risks. Again, understanding what our type of healthcare organization what we are and how we operate. Knowing what our compliances are. Conducting a compliant risk assessment, and this is usually what the core team at a healthcare system might do, being able to read those reports and understand what risks are, and how do we intend to mitigate these risks as healthcare organizations is really critical. This really protects everyone as a board of directors, the CEO, and their organization, the staff. And ultimately making sure that we offer quality healthcare and accessible healthcare to our urban Indian health population. We also must understand investigations and prosecutions. All of those different procedures around that, and at what point on how do we inquire, how do we get the reports all the way from the healthcare center staff, program, department, the floor unit, up to C-suite leadership, to the CEO, and to the board of directors. So as a board member, making sure that we understand all these different processes, the different components of it, and the different aspects of these is really key and important. Next slide. So not enough of the right data could be a challenge for a board of directors, okay? Or we might be receiving too much of the wrong type of data, okay? Poorly presented data, not clear on what the board dashboard metrics might look like, okay? So early on in our talk, we talked a little bit about how the mission statement, the vision statement, as an overarching kind of goal is really key and important. And everything else falls behind that. So when we're looking at those data and those metrics and those measures, it should add up to that ultimate, making sure that by doing all these appropriate steps as a healthcare organization, our team, our CEO and the team, they're getting to that overarching goal. And so as a board of directors, it's really important to understand what is the kind of data I should be reading, the reports I should be reading, am I understanding it, and is this contributing to the mission and the vision of that organization? We might be spending too much time in the weeds, okay? Or maybe we're possibly micromanaging, okay? Or redoing some board committee work, okay? So really being able to look at what are we currently doing? Are we moving along as a group and accomplishing all of our goals and objectives as a board of director is really key and important when we're talking about these are some things to look at. There are no meeting times dedicated to ongoing topical like board training and education. Majority of the board of directors that I've worked with, they're really key and they're really on top of making sure that there's that ongoing meetings, but also training and education that is aligned with the expectations with the board of directors. Next slide. So poorly led meetings also could really contribute to wasting time and not accomplishing all the things that we're set out to do. Possibly there might be lack of leadership discussions. Our agendas are not designed and allowing for us to have a productive flow, productive conversation, and getting to our desired outcome as a team. So maybe looking at our agendas might be another thing to do. Our minutes, possibly they're red light transcripts, Okay, so making sure that our minutes are also understandable, everybody comprehends it. There's, you know, even the way it's written, are there action steps? Are there, you know, clearly identified next steps and who's responsible for that work or the committee work, so forth. Board members, we might not be prepared. Okay, so we might not have read materials that we needed to talk and discuss and agree on or vote on. So it's really important to come to meetings prepared. Materials not available ahead of time, and last minute changes and additions to meetings. And so thinking about ways to mitigate some of these is really important. Next slide. We also go into something called human interaction, and it's just human nature that sometimes things arise, and you know, and that's conflict. It's a natural part of life, and it provides us an opportunity for growth, for evaluation, to have some good discussions about a particular conflict, and making sure that we are able to kind of work through it as a team. We have to understand what causes us conflict and how do we respond to conflict. And this is much more of a self-reflection question for you all, and making sure that what exactly, how are you defining conflict? What is conflict to you? What is the magnitude of it, and how does that affect the way the board of directors are operating, and being able to, again, work through that and get into the next stage of work that we need to do as a team. So it's really important to ask these critical questions. Next slide. So these are additional just components that could be sources to board conflict. Possibly that we have a performance issue related to our key leadership position that we've hired, possibly conflict with other board members during a meeting, possibly how decisions are made or what decisions are made. Maybe the board of directors is too involved with hiring and firing staff other than the CEO themselves. Possibly contracts that might create conflict of interest to a board member. There's a lot of different things that could create conflict among board members. Next slide, please. So when you're the only tool is a hammer, and all of your problems look like nails, what do we go out and do? We're going to be hammering things. You feel like you're hammering everything, right? And that's what we want to encourage you to avoid doing. So let's go ahead and move into the next slide and talk a little bit about how to expand the tools as a board member to your tool belt, okay? We encourage everybody to understand and begin to become well-versed around clinical quality of care. And you could do this in many ways, but these are just some of the things that would help you to understand clinically where we stand, what services we provide, what are some potential ways to improve our healthcare delivery system. So under the quality program, there might be some programs that already exist. Understanding what they are at your healthcare organization. There's root cause analysis strategies, tools around that particular type of task to do. We could also look at patient-family engagement opportunities around that and how to improve healthcare systems from the perspective of the patient, the family, and those we serve. We might come across employee issues, and under that, there are different ways to look and address that. Reviewing and capturing, for example, employee satisfaction surveys, really trying to get the staff's perspective and their input on how to possibly improve maybe a system, a process, or the work that they do so that they enjoy the work and contribute to that whole movement towards quality access and quality healthcare. Okay, the decision also making process. learning and making sure that we reinforce ourselves as board of directors that we can concur, concordance, the majority rules, however other approaches that might be typically outlined in your bylaws and how you operate, that guides us and it keeps us in that fence, so to speak. And so you're not out of line and you're able to participate in a much more meaningful, impactful way. Next slide. We also want to make sure that we encourage you guys that there might be peer board member conflict, and there might be some procedures around that, and those may already exist in your bylaws as well. And we're not going to go into much detail here, but you're welcome to ask questions. Next slide. Do you ever feel like your buttons are being pushed? Okay. Next slide. This is a quick question for you to ponder on. I wanted, and this is an important question, because when you feel like there's a certain button on you that is pushed and it's not favorable to the person or group of individuals who may have pushed that button, please take the time to take time out and consider how you're responding. And am I responding or am I reacting? Now, there are different ways to, there's a lot of things to consider. And here on the screen, there's several examples of it. Keep in mind, for example, every story has two sides. Making sure that we're differing expectations and they're not aligned. For example, I'm acting and making decisions based and aligned to the mission and the vision statement. But making sure that the other party are also aligned. So there might be differences in that type of thing. So there's just an example here. These slides will be made available for you to browse through, and just making sure that you understand there's other things to consider when we're beginning to approach difficult situations, and take a time out and to consider these different elements. Next slide. I wanted to bring up this important pyramid. It really shows on the right side here. It's the very bottom of the pyramid. Basically, the foundation is your values. Okay, your value system is a really important component of who you are and how you lead and how you participate as a board of directors. Being aware of our feelings, our emotions, our thoughts. And then finally, that really contributes to our actions and the behaviors that we take. So the more we are aware and versus the less we are aware. So the more we are aware, we are more effective. The less we are aware of all of these different components here, values, feelings, our emotions, our thoughts, then, you know, the less we are aware of those things, the higher likelihood that there might be a disruption in the way we operate with others around us and how we respond when that button is pushed, so to speak. I also wanted to just briefly share 6 ways to improve self-awareness. Ask for feedback, recognizing your own strengths and weaknesses. Self-reflection is really, really important. Monitoring our self-talk. Making sure that your self-talk is positive and that you celebrate the wins and not dwell on failures or challenges. Practicing saying no, okay? And then question your decision. These are some quick 6 ways to improve the way we do, how we keep in check with and making sure that we're self-aware of all of these different components of us as board of directors, okay, as leaders. Next slide. There's also additional soft skills that are really important component and a part of us as leaders. We need to make sure that we keep abreast in our communication, the different kinds of communication styles, making sure that we're motivated, being aware of what kind of leader you are, a sense of responsibility, approaching things in a teamwork type of atmosphere or approach mentality. Coming to the table with a problem-solving mentality, being decisiveness, being decisive is really key and important, because in healthcare system, science is driving the way we deliver care consistently, and we've seen evidence of this in the past year or so. And so it's really important to come to the table kind of doing that homework, understanding what's at hand, what data, what report is at hand, what do we need to decide on. That's really key. Ability to work under pressure and time management, flexible, and also being able to have a good negotiation and conflict resolution skills as well. Okay, so I believe this might be my last slide. Next slide. So when you reflect back on your current board of directors, and after this experience and after this presentation, I just ask you, what are the 2 things you could implement or work to change as a member of a board of directorship? Okay, and possibly some ways to be more effective. And how could you accomplish that? Some questions to ask yourself as you close out your day this evening. So next slide. I will pause here for questions, and I appreciate your attendance and your attention.
Well, everyone, we're right at 7:55. We have a few more items to get through. We certainly have time for your questions. We will have our knowledge check polls one last time. And I want to remind you that we have an evaluation survey that we'd like you to complete to help us out. Thank you so much. I'd like to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge tonight's presenters, Dr. Kimberly Fowler, Evelina Maho, a really well-informed information, full of information, just a lot to digest. I hope you feel the same way I do, that you kind of have filled to the brim with information, facts, figures, and new ideas about UIOs. Again, I'd like to encourage you to click on our SurveyMonkey link to go straight to the evaluation and complete that evaluation. It'll take about 6 or 7 minutes. We check those out carefully, so they're not meant to be burdensome. That SurveyMonkey evaluation will tell us a lot of things we need to know and validate our approaches, or give us more ideas about improving our approaches. So with that said, again, I would want to encourage you to join us for our session 2, 2 weeks from tonight on April 28th. High performing boards in a virtual world will present its second evening. We'll cover board selection and recruitment and the characteristics of high performing boards on April 28th. And then 2 weeks after that will be our final session. Of course, we'll certify your attendance at all these sessions and make sure that the records are kept about your presence here and achieving your attendance at the board governance trainings as required by IHS. Again, thank you everyone for your joining in with us. We look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks. And again, I hope you're able to complete that survey evaluation for us. And with that, I think we can all say good night, right at 8 p.m., right on time. We made it. It's a pleasure seeing everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks right back here. Have a good evening.